Hi, we're going to talk about JFK real quick here. We're going to kind of go through it quick. Um, I've had feedback saying shorter videos are a little bit better. I know this will be a little bit longer, but I'll kind of go through the topics quick here. We're just going to briefly look at some of the key points of the JFK presidency. He's the president between Eisenhower and JFK, elected in 1960. In fact, wins this famous election against Nixon, who was the sitting vice president for the previous 8 years under Eisenhower. It's the first televised presidential debate. And what's kind of interesting is JFK wins this debate hands down. People watching it on TV, JFK looks younger, more attractive, he stands out. Black and white TV, his suit stands out from the background better. Nixon had spent like the previous night in the hospital, he's sweating, looks uncomfortable. But people on the radio thought it was much closer. In fact, some people even speculate that Nixon had a slight edge for people who listened to the debate on the radio, but people who watched it on TV overwhelmingly thought that JFK had won. And so JFK wins. One of his slogans is New Frontier, that America is going to move forward into this new frontier. We're going to fix education problems. We're going to fix civil rights problems. We're going to, push forward this new younger generation. We're going to be able to fix a lot of the problems with America. Looking up here, we look at here and we have flexible response. JFK did not like Eisenhower's whole massive retaliation strategy. JFK thought that Eisenhower had a bit flawed strategy. That JFK thought that Eisenhower was reducing the conventional military, bombers, tanks, and so forth, too much, and then putting too much faith in nuclear deterrence. And so JFK talks about a flexible response. We need to be able to have a flexible response. We need to be able to fight 2.5 wars. That's 2 regional wars, and be able to fight a small brush fire war somewhere else. And that we don't have the ability to do that under Eisenhower. We need to be able to have a flexible response. That Eisenhower's put us in this situation where we can't fight an immediate conventional war properly, and then we're going to have to rely on nukes, which might make us more likely to use nukes. But part of flexible response was that JFK during the debates kept hammering on the missile gap, saying that the Soviets had this huge advantage in missiles and so forth, and it's going to be growing and skyrocketing, and that for shame, and that this puts us at a severe disadvantage. In fact, it wasn't true. In fact, the Soviets had very, 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 very few missiles that could hit us at the time, and it wasn't projected to be growing. Eisenhower is very frustrated by it, even though he's not running for president. He's still president. It's his policies, though. He even actually has JFK and LBJ, JFK's running mate and vice president, sit down with some of the top military advisors, saying, this missile gap that you're talking about in the election isn't true. But JFK stuck with the missile gap, but it was very, very, very effective. And was one consequence of the missile gap is that JFK then starts developing more and more missiles, more spending on military, which ends up leading to more of an arms race. However, he does have the nuclear test ban treaty and some things like that, especially for environmental reasons. But mutual deterrence, Robert McNamara, JFK's Secretary of Defense here, one thing he even talks about was, mutually assured destruction. This concept that, we won't go to nuclear war, we can prevent it because of the fact that, both sides will be destroyed, have unacceptable losses and so forth. But, this flexible response that, we don't always have to rely on nuclear weapons. We have to have a flexible response to meet different threats and to be able to handle a threat without it escalating potentially to nuclear war. So we need more conventional military to be able to fight 2.5 wars. We need the Green Berets, something JFK helps create. We need to be more flexible. That Eisenhower kind of pigeonholed us into a situation where we can't be flexible. We don't have a strong enough conventional army. We just have to use nukes or not, and eventually that's going to lead us to the point where we have to use nukes. The Soviets, Khrushchev, their leader, builds the Berlin Wall when he's JFK's president. Don't forget, under Truman, we had to do the Berlin airlift because they had temporarily shut off the Axis. But then after the Berlin airlift is successful, it gets reopened back up. Now it's to supplies and so forth. But now it's completely going to be shut off at the Berlin Wall, and they throw it up. Khrushchev, the Soviet Union, throws up the Berlin Wall overnight. Don't forget, West Berlin, at the end of World War II, they had decided, with the Yalta Conference and all that, they're going to partition Germany up into different zones, and West Berlin was going to be controlled by the Allies. East Berlin is going to be controlled by the Soviets. But the problem is West Berlin is completely in the East German zone, completely in the Soviet sphere. So the West Berlin, which is pro-Allies, pro-America, and so forth, which is under our influence and guidance, is like an island in an ocean of East Germany, an island in an ocean of Soviet influence. And Khrushchev throws this Berlin Wall up without notice, just throws up, like a chain link fence, like barbed wire and all that, and then builds the wall around. And it was scary for a lot of people. And why did they do that? In part because a lot of their best people in East Berlin, the best educated, the best minds, were moving to West Berlin. It was seen as more vibrant, better economy, and so forth. And it was just losing a PR battle, so they threw up the Berlin Wall. Berlin Wall is going to culminate, and eventually come down, but you have Ronald Reagan's famous, Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall, then, 2 years later or whatever it was, and then it finally does come down. But the Berlin Wall comes up, and Vietnam War. Truman had done a little bit of funding of the French in Vietnam. Eisenhower did a little bit more. JFK does a little bit more than Eisenhower. So each president takes a little bit of a bigger step into Vietnam. When JFK is finally assassinated, I think we have, typically, I see reported around like 13 to 16,000 soldiers in Vietnam. Which is a relatively small involvement, especially compared to what it's going to be under LBJ after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. But it's still relatively smaller involvement. But each succeeding president, sends a little bit more aid, sends a little bit more advisors into Vietnam. But one thing is that Diem, the South Vietnamese dictator, you might say, America pulls its support from because he was being kind of ruthless and harsh, and he gets assassinated. In fact, just a couple weeks before JFK was assassinated, and JFK regretted that he didn't want Diem to be killed, but he thought that he should lose the support of America and power. But remember, we were supporting South Vietnam because North Vietnam, we saw them as the aggressors. North Vietnam was communist. South Vietnam was more capitalist. So we were supporting South Vietnam. But you see the involvement in Vietnam growing. Eisenhower grows it a little bit from Truman. JFK grows it from Eisenhower. But it's not big yet, but it will become big after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in LBJ's presidency. The Bay of Pigs, 1961. The Bay of Pigs, we train Cuban exiles and people who fled Cuba to go back and throughout Fidel Castro, throughout the communist regime. They get all this American training. And the plan actually gets formulated by the government under Eisenhower, but never gets carried out during his presidency. JFK gives it the go-ahead, except he reduces the air and the naval power of American actual forces, and it fails miserably. These poor people that we send in and train, they get killed or captured, most of them, and this is kind of considered like an American blunder, a black eye. A lot of people see it as America kind of failing. A lot of people start questioning JFK a bit. A lot of people see it, Cuban Missile Crisis, as a turnaround, as a positive thing for JFK to kind of fixes this blemish. But the Bay of Pigs, so we're trying to, Cold War era, we're trying to throw out Fidel Castro, we're trying to remove the communists. Remember, Cuba's, right on America's doorstep. It's something like 90 miles from the tip of Florida, and we can't have communists that close to America. But the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets move missiles and nuclear warheads into Cuba. Now, we see this as a major act of aggression. But if we take a step back and put ourselves into the shoes of the Soviets, well, why did they do that? Well, don't forget, and a lot of Americans forget this, we just remember they moved missiles into Cuba, which is right on our doorstep. We forget that, JFK had moved nuclear missiles into Italy and Turkey is right on the Soviet Union's doorstep. So they saw it as, we're just doing what you're doing. At the same time, the Soviets remembered the missile gap, that JFK ran on the missile gap, and the Soviets knew that he was inflating their numbers, and so they saw him, and then he comes in and increases a lot of the military spending and stuff like that. They see this as he's a guy we got to be tougher on here, and so the Cuban Missile Crisis happens. And although you could say that JFK helped create the problem by moving missiles into Turkey, by the missile gap and things like that, he handles it well and gets us out of it. There were certain people like, Curtis LeMay saying, go on there and just bomb Cuba, wipe them off the face of the earth, even though that might mean war with Soviets, which could mean nuclear war, both sides lobbing, missiles at one another, which could, be devastating for the planet Earth. Curtis LeMay saying, we can go on there, we can wipe them out, we can do the first strike. But he listens to cooler heads. And he takes the advice of some of his cooler heads here in his office, and he handles it. He quarantines Cuba. He sends messages to the Soviet Union. He quarantines Cuba. What I mean by that is, he sends the U.S. Navy and blockades it, and he won't let Soviet ships come in to Cuba. And taking a less hostile approach than what some people are advocating, which is war, a military strike. And so he diffuses the situation, and the Soviets agreed to pull the missiles out. We secretly agree to pull our missiles out. And so it's so we both kind of save face at the same time. JFK promises, we're not going to go into Cuba, we're not going to take them over. The Bay of Pigs also helped cause the Cuban Missile Crisis too. I mean, here's, Soviets, are supposed to be protecting other smaller communist nations, and this is American aggression in their eyes. Missiles going into Cuba protects them from American aggression, and they have something factual to point to: Bay of Pigs, American aggression. But he diffuses the situation with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thankfully, JFK wins because he can go to the American people, and say, look, I diffused the situation peacefully, nobody died, we didn't have to do a military strike, they took the missiles out. Khrushchev gets to go to his people and say, look, I win, look, they promised not to go into Cuba, they were going to destroy Cuba, I saved them. Then at the same time, JFK later pulls missiles out of Turkey, so Khrushchev can say to his people he won, JFK can say to his people he won. Both sides end up winning. Nobody wins with nuclear war. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, very controversial. Fog of War is a good documentary if you're ever looking for a documentary to watch, but very controversial. Secretary of Defense, he's going to be Secretary of Defense under JFK and throughout most of, or much of LBJ's presidency. And so, very, very controversial. He helps create that mutually assured destruction idea. Vietnam War, he's the Secretary of Defense for that very controversial war. So, very controversial from the Vietnam War and supporting that and so forth. He starts to lose some faith in there. There's some discrepancies about how much he supported it or not, but it was his job to support it. How much should he support it in private life? But Camelot, JFK, he's vibrant, he's young, he's athletic, and all this, and he's got this great image in front of the camera. He's got a young wife and cute little kids, and images of his kids under his desk while he's sitting at his desk in the Oval Office. And a lot of people portray it as Camelot, like this fairy tale. It's like America. We're young, we're up and coming, and it's great. And this image is kind of stuck in our mind. Like some people say, in part because JFK was assassinated so young that people just have him frozen in time. He's just this young, vibrant guy. A lot of people didn't realize, he suffered from, severe back pains, and oftentimes had to wear a brace and get shots and stuff like that. But the people see him as young and athletic and vibrant, and this young family you can fall in love with. His wife redecorates the White House. There's this big TV special about it. It's just, appealing to so many people fall in love with them. He actually proposes tax cuts. A rising tide lifts all boats. Tax cuts across the board for the wealthy and poor. So that's kind of interesting. There. Remodernize industry. He says, look, a lot of our factories and so forth are using machines that have become outdated. They haven't. They need an incentive to get new machines and push forward. The government needs to help push these new machines to make our factories more efficient. A lot of the new European factories and so forth that have been built post-war, post-World War II, which destroyed a lot of the infrastructure and factories and so forth of Europe. Are using newer machines, better machines. We're using old machines, a lot of it from World War II or before. We need to remodernize. The government needs to push these, loans and make incentives and grants and stuff to try to push some of this forward. And he's somewhat successful with that. During his presidency, you see the civil rights movement start to grow. In the 50s, it's, the 60s, civil rights movement is born. It's starting to grow. You see the Freedom Riders, they're testing. The court said, you can't have a segregated bus if it crossed state lines. The national government can regulate interstate commerce, which is business that crosses state lines. And so if a Greyhound bus or some other type of bus goes from one state to a different state, the federal government legally can regulate that. So the federal government can say no segregation. So these freedom riders say, okay, we're going to test it. The Congress of Racial Equality is a civil rights group that does a lot of this. And so we're going to test this. And unfortunately, they're just, when they do this, and remember, they're just riding peacefully in a bus, blacks and white people together, they oftentimes get attacked. People wait for them at bus stops or whatever, attack them with bats, clubs. One even gets firebombed. But the freedom riders get attacked. And JFK's forced to use action, forced to send the military in to defend people just peacefully riding on buses as they travel across state lines, these desegregated buses. Robert Kennedy, RFK, JFK's brother, Attorney General, pushes a lot for desegregation and civil rights and things like that. He actually was running for president himself. Unfortunately, he was assassinated too. He was running for president in 1968 when he was assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan. But he pushes for it. And when he's Attorney General, and he's speaking as Attorney General, and you look at when he talks to Southern governors and so forth about not obstructing, people trying to go to, African Americans trying to go to college or whatever, trying to desegregate. When he talks to these Southern governors and so forth, he tries to focus more on legal merits as opposed to moral arguments. And I think he feels that's more effective. Like, look, legally we have to do this. I think he maybe figures, you can't change somebody's heart and mind so easily, but if you focus on the law, this is the law, this is what you have to do, that's what you can do. But after he's no longer the Attorney General, which is like the government's top lawyer, he focuses a lot of moral arguments, though, too, but as Attorney General, it's more like legal arguments. I remember him one time saying something to the effect of, he was Catholic, very religious and stuff like that, but he said something to the effect of, what if I what if when I die and I go to heaven and on Judgment Day, I stand before God, and what if he's black? And he looks at me and he says, what did you do for civil rights? What did you do to help? Something to that effect. And, he argues a lot on moral arguments, more not as Attorney General, but as Attorney General, he argues legally. He's the legal law guy of the land, as Attorney General. During the end of JFK's short presidency, unfortunately, because he's assassinated, you start to see the civil rights movement really start to heat up and take steam. I mean, you have the March on Birmingham with MLK Jr., he gets arrested. You have the famous racist Bull Connor, attacking people and all that in Birmingham, Alabama. Later on that same year, in 1963, you have the March on Washington, the famous MLK I Have a Dream speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial there. He actually starts off referencing 1863. He starts off his speech saying 50 years ago, referencing the Gettysburg Address 100 years ago, and he goes in to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, which took effect January 1st, 1863, but yet African Americans still aren't free, and so forth. And he references, the Declaration of Independence, which all Americans were to fall heir, that we haven't done a good enough job living up to the Declaration of Independence, which is who we say we are, all men are created equal. We all have certain unalienable rights given to us: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And so this famous Martin Luther King Jr. speech, arguably the most famous, or one of the top most famous political speeches. It really is a political speech because it's about civil rights and so forth. Even though he might not be considered a politician, it's a political speech, I would say, because it helps advance politics, advance civil rights, advance liberty. And he's talking about, let's live up to the Declaration of Independence. Push forward. People are telling him to wait. Martin Luther King Jr., wait. Now is not the time. Look at 1863 in the March in Birmingham, where he's arrested and so forth. Letter from a Birmingham jail. He says, I have some people saying you need to go farther. Other people saying you're going, too far. Wait, now is not the time. And he says, look, I'm taking the right course. We can't wait, because wait is never. We can't turn violent and do more, because that's not right. We need to stay on the course of love, not bitter hatred, not waiting where if waiting means accepting, that you're less than. But so, in 1963, you see the civil rights movement in full swing here at the end of JFK's presidency, in full swing, Southern Democrats are going to start to become a swing vote, potentially voting with Republicans in the North or the Northern Democrats. Remember, the Democrats dominate the South for most of post-Civil War up until about the 60s here. And then it's going to start to shift a bit, and Southern white Democrats are going to start to become more of a swing vote, and even create various third parties for, George Wallace or whoever. Unfortunately, JFK is assassinated in Dallas, Texas. There's a lot of mystery and stuff surrounding that. I believe if you look at all the evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald did kill JFK, but most Americans, based on some of the polls I've seen, actually disagree with me on that. But that's not going to be an AP test or anything like that. But so it's this assassination leaves a lot of people wondering and so forth. But we always have this image of JFK in our mind as young, vibrant, attractive, a likable family, and all that. Cold War, Cuban Missile Crisis, preventing a nuclear war between the two countries. The Berlin Wall gets thrown up, so you can see the heat of the Cold War, really heating up here. Vietnam, we're not really fully involved yet. Some people think that JFK might have been kind of getting ready to pull us out of Vietnam. That's debatable, but it's possible. So this is just a brief overview of some of the big issues during JFK's presidency. Of course, you need to investigate some of these in a little bit better detail, but that's kind of some of the main issues going on at the time.